As several states move to diluting their labour laws, 10 central trade unions have come together to jointly condemn the move. The unions have called the decisions, and I quote, an inhuman crime and brutality on working people, end of quote. Uttar Pradesh has suspended several labour-related legislations for 3 years, and Madhya Pradesh has done it for 1,000 days. Effectively, in these states, minimum wages are not mandatory. There will be no check on working conditions or guarantee of occupational safety, among several other changes. While some of these changes have drawn condemnation, India's labour laws are indeed archaic and need an overhaul. Sample this. India has over 40 central labour laws and over 200 state laws. Now, do we really need so many laws, or does this simply foster Inspector Raj or License Raj? The recent economic surveys have called for overhauling labour laws to unleash the potential of India's small businesses by dedicating a separate chapter. The survey makes the case that deregulated and flexible labour laws are the way forward to boost productivity and create jobs. Joining me now is the author of the economic survey, the Chief Economic Advisor, Krishnamurthy Subramanian. Mr. Subramanian, many thanks for joining us here on CNBC-TV18. To start with, we are still awaiting details of what exactly UP and Madhya Pradesh want to get done. Of course, these are ordinances that still require presidential assent and are waiting approval from the central government. But I go back to the economic survey. The economic survey spoke of deregulation. You held up the Rajasthan example as a playbook to follow. Do you support what is being done by UP and Madhya Pradesh, which is not deregulation, but a suspension of all laws?
So, Shereen, it's important to keep in mind that there are two aspects to the changes in the labour laws that are being done at the state level. Firstly, the ease of compliance. For instance, as you were mentioning, there are a bunch of laws, and compliance across them. In many cases, the definitions actually of the same thing, like a wage, is different across different laws, and that just creates confusion. Bringing in single window clearances, for instance, these are all aspects that are actually are about enhancing the ease of compliance. The second part is,
Sure.
In order to understand that, which is actually deregulation, it's important to keep in mind that, for a country like India, the most important priority has to be job creation. And there is no other form of social and economic inclusion than a job in the formal sector. I just take my own example. I'm the second generation. My father actually got a job in the formal sector, and he was able to educate us, and thereby actually we were able to uplift ourselves. And for an economy like India with such a young population, it's therefore very, very critical to have enough jobs being created. And jobs are not created when you actually have firms remaining small, for years together. And one of the key restrictions there actually are some of these. And let me, use the example of Rajasthan, for instance. When the threshold for the Industrial Disputes Act was 100 employees, many firms chose to be at about 95, 98 employees. And once that increased to 300, they were able to go to about 290 employees. So that's a clear addition of about 170, 180 employees in each of these firms. And that's how basically jobs then get created. So this is a very important aspect that we need to keep in mind. If we have to attract investment, and jobs don't get created without actually firms being large enough, investment coming in, and especially if you have to sort of benefit from some of the firms in China who actually are looking to move out, which is a very important opportunity for India to latch on to. These are important.
Sure. No, so, I understand the point that you're making about deregulation. And as I pointed out, that the survey talks about deregulation. The survey didn't talk about doing away with all labour laws. I want you to comment on the reactions that have come in, not just from whether it's the BMS or the trade unions, etc., but also from people who are looking at what has happened in UP and MP and suggest that given the current situation and given the current economic climate, not just domestically, but also globally, that what we're ending up doing, and to quote T.N. Nainan, inviting new anarchies on top of what has already been wrought by COVID-19. You're opening up a battlefront that you don't necessarily need to open up at this point in time by taking this approach, this heavy-handed approach of, with one stroke, saying we suspend all labour regulation.
Well, first, I think it's important to clarify that the regulations relating to bonded labor, the one relating to payment of wages, and the ones relating to organizational safety. Those are actually the ones that are being accepted. Now, as I was saying earlier as well, what do you think of, when you talk about deregulation, it is about actually those, regulations that create hindrances. We basically try and eliminate that, and which is what in spirit these laws are doing, and they will encourage, as we provided very careful evidence on with Rajasthan, these will encourage investment. Through the investment, they'll also actually encourage firms to become larger, and thereby create more employment. Take the example of Bangladesh, for instance. The textile firms there are substantially larger, and that's because they, while all of us, in the subcontinent, Indian subcontinent, inherited the same kind of labor laws, they went ahead and actually deregulated and relaxed those. And in fact, actually went along the lines that some of the states now are doing, and that enabled them to create significant jobs in the textile sector. The other important point that is very important to keep, which is crucial to keep in mind is, look, when you talk about the formal sector, right, jobs in the formal sector, about 11% of the workforce. So you have, a small minority that gets all the privileges, and, have a huge majority that is even deprived of actually having a job in the formal sector. Now, policy making always involves trade-offs. Now, question is, do you want to actually give more and more to the 11% that already have privileges, or do you want to focus on the remaining 89%? And to give an example, basically, many of us have traveled in unreserved third-class compartments when we were young. What happens there, actually, whoever gets into the coach at the first station ensures that nobody else gets in after that. But you have a large set of people who also want to get to their destinations, and they don't get the opportunity. The situation with labor laws is very similar.
Okay, so to put it simply, do you believe that the economic survey held up the Rajasthan playbook, which did not, by the way, do away with the labor laws as is being proposed by UP and MP? And I say proposed because these are ordinances that will require presidential assent. Do you believe that the UP and MP playbook ought to be followed by states, or are you standing by what the economic survey held up, which was Rajasthan, which was much more judicious and balanced in its approach?
So we used in the economic survey the Rajasthan, change as an example of a broader point, which was that, labor laws are really restricting firms, because what, entrepreneurs do is they actually create, they bring their firms to about 98 employees, and then when they reach that threshold, they go and create another firm. And thereby we actually have firms that remain really small despite them becoming older. And we also pointed out, for instance, if you compare, let's say, India with other countries like the United States, let's say starts at the same level in India, and let's say United States, take a firm that is less than 5 years old. When it becomes, by the time it becomes 30 years old, the firm in the United States has created almost 7.5 times more employment, while India actually it has created,
but Mr. Subramanian, doesn't that have to do with what you have also called perverse incentivization? You're forcing people to stay small so that they can use the incentives that the state provides. Instead of complete suspension of labor regulation, why don't you look at reimagining the way that incentives are given so that firms don't feel like they need to remain small to be incentivized?
No, I'm precisely talking about the incentive that, a threshold like the one that, that is being relaxed creates. That when you have a threshold, each of these laws creates incentives. When you have a threshold at 100 employees, firms basically, the incentive it creates is to remain small. Now, and similarly, these relaxations, and even to take into account, for instance, the minimum wages, right? There's also the aspect of enforcement. When you take, any law, it is actually about the way it appears on the books versus how it actually gets implemented. We also covered this in the economic survey, that while you actually have, very lofty ideals for how minimum wages should be paid, the actual reality is much worse, and that also creates opportunities for rent seeking, which is also something that you want to avoid. So
but wouldn't that, to Nainan's point, won't that make the situation far worse? That you will now have each state doing pretty much what it wants to do, and in the vacuum of having absolutely no regulation, you might in fact make the rent seeking far worse.
Let's understand where the rent seeking originates from, Shereen. Rent seeking comes when you actually have a law and the implementation of that law, there is scope for interpretation of that and thereby rent seeking. So I don't understand, where this argument is, that you're putting. If you actually reduce some of these regulations, those that are clearly hindrances, the need for rent seeking or the opportunity for rent seeking goes out, not come in.
Okay. Let me quote to you what the press release put out by the Ministry of Labour and Employment at the end of a meeting that they had with employers' organizations, which is really industry. And some of the suggestions that this press release talks about is, of course, relaxations of the provisions of the Industrial Dispute Act, to suspend labour laws for the next 2 to 3 years, except the provisions like minimum wages, bonus and statutory dues, to increase the working hours to 12 hours per day, and so on and so forth. There's a long list, and there's of course also the response that's come in from trade unions, the BMS, etc., saying that this is all in contravention of the ILO, and the central trade unions saying today that they may in fact look at moving the ILO against these proposed labour law changes. So, how there seems to be a need for greater engagement to try and arrive at a path which is somewhere in the middle.
See, the changes that were being, worked on at the central level. So, the 43 odd laws that were there, those have been composed, now have been collected into 4 codes. The Code on Wages, the Code on Organizational Safety, the Code on Industrial Action, and the Code on Social Security. And these have been done through extensive deliberations between the government and all stakeholders, and these labor codes actually have been brought in after that such deliberations, and in fact the code on wages has already been passed.
But sir, the states are not following the labor codes. But sir, the states are not following the centre's labour codes. In fact, only one labour code has in fact been passed so far. The others are still with the standing committee. The states have not waited for the central labour code to be formalised. The states have decided to use the ordinance route to do away with all regulation.
Remember, Shereen, that labour is a concurrent subject, and this particular exercise that was going on was at the central level. And states have actually, given the situation that you have with the COVID episode and the need to ensure that employment generation happens, states have actually, they are within the rights to basically implement the changes that they have done.
Okay, just hang in there, sir. I need to take a very quick break. We will come back and continue to talk about this and more. Back in a moment. You're watching Restarting India, the Labour Logjam. We're back in a second.
जिसको पीते ही ऐसा लगता है जैसे
जन्नत, जिंदगी,
sublime, fresh,
awesome, संतुलित, बहुत मस्त यार।
पैकेट से कैसे पी?
Amul Masti Buttermilk, Desi Refresher. With clenched fists, we fought our first freedom struggle. This time, we wash our hands with soap for freedom from Corona. India, wash hands, break the chain.
Welcome back. You're watching Restarting India, the Labour Logjam. We're in conversation with the Chief Economic Advisor, Krishnamurthy Subramanian. Mr. Subramanian, one of the other arguments that's being made against the moves by UP and MP in suspending all labour regulation is that, look, we're in a situation today where there is a huge trust deficit on the back of what has happened with migrant labour. I mean, those images speak for themselves. This is a time when you need to provide a safety net. This is the time when you want to build bridges, when you want more trust between employer and employee, specifically in this case where labour is crucial for restarting economic activity. And this would, in fact, this coercive way would, in fact, boomerang.
So firstly, Shereen, I think we have to understand that, and I've mentioned this earlier as well, that the labor laws apply for jobs that are in the formal sector. Migrant labor is basically corresponds to jobs in the informal sector. So let's not mix the two issues. In fact, if anything, you know,
Not
because
necessarily.
of the kind of,
Not necessarily.
Let me finish the point, Shereen.
Yeah.
So if, for instance, if you given the 7 decades experience that we've had with these kind of labor laws, they've not created enough jobs. The reason we've actually had such migrant labor is because we've not had enough, job creation in the formal sector. As I mentioned, and I repeat this statistic, which is that 11% of the workforce works in the formal sector. Huge majority, 89% actually works in the informal sector. And it is because of the restrictions that there are. So you can actually, and one can do this counterfactual experiment that, if you actually had, let's say, provided the necessary relaxations and focused on creating jobs for this, and reducing thereby that large majority, then it is actually, and I would say, based on my research, that it's arguable that this proportion would have been much lower, the proportion of the informal sector, and that's what has been seen in many other countries as well. And if your overall, informal sector is lower as a percentage, then the migrant population would also have been lower. So on the one hand, we can't basically be seen to be, let's say, talk about migrant labor, but not at the same time taking the necessary steps that are required to reduce the informalization and thereby the migrant labor as well. And these restrictions are one of those key parts in that calculus.
Do you believe that this will, in fact, at this point in time, be the appropriate thing to do to create more jobs, to draw in more investments? I mean, do you believe that this is actually going to provide that fillip that clearly government seems to believe that it will?
Look, this is all, of course, about, in the future, and nobody knows for sure, especially during the kind of uncertain times that we are in. But what is critical, and this is something which is important to recognize, is that if we basically need more investment to come in, and we have to ensure that jobs are created. And these will be, steps that will help in that direction.
Okay, so you are in support of more states taking this route, which is to do away with most or all labor regulation with the exception of 2 or 3 at this point in time?
I am in favor of the deregulation of these labor laws, which we showed very clearly using carefully crafted evidence that they are binding constraints on firms being larger and thereby more formal sector jobs being created, firms being more productive, and these are actually binding constraints. So I am in favor of greater deregulation of these labor laws.
Okay, let me talk about that informal sector that you spoke of, the 90% which don't really have that safety net at all that we just spoke of. Given where we see ourselves today and the wait continues for the relief measures that the government is expected to announce, what is the realistic expectation in being able to provide that safety net for the large informal economy?
So one of the key aspects, Shereen, for the migrant labor is the fact that they are not able to access the public distribution system in the state or in the district where they are working, because their ration card, for instance, works in the state where they are supposed to be residing. And one of the key initiatives that the government is working on is one nation, one ration card, which will basically enable portability of the ration card. And as we speak, there are many states that actually are in the process of implementing this. And once we have portability of the ration card, then under the National Food Security Act, the NFSA, which basically gives 35 kilograms of food grains in normal times, and that's been enhanced by another 25 kilograms. Given assuming a household of 5 individuals, because every individual is getting 5 kilograms more. So once that portability is enabled, then one of the key aspects actually for that creates vulnerability for the migrant workers will be addressed. At the same time, other measures actually also in trying to bring in more financial inclusion, like we've done, through the Jan Dhan Yojana, for instance, which has reached, large sections. And by the way, this is a parenthetical comment, but an important one, which is that, unlike countries like the United States, which are, physically mailing checks, we've been able to reach the, these vulnerable sections just through the click of a button, right, of the mouse. And that's because of the Jan Dhan, Jan Dhan Aadhaar mobile trinity. So extending the same actually to these migrant laborers, apart from the PDS portability, would really enable in bringing a permanent fix to some of these vulnerabilities.
Since I have you with me, sir, I'd like to ask you on how one should read the government's plan to increase the borrowing program to 12 lakh crore rupees from 7.8 lakh crore rupees. How should we read this? How should we make sense of this? Largely on account of revenue shortfall, or also factoring in expenditure compression, revenue shortfall, plus the need for relief?
It's a combination of all of that. If you go by any of the previous episodes, internationally, whenever there has been a crisis like this, take the Great Depression, which was followed by the New Deal, or the take the World War II, after which Europe got the Marshall Plan, or the global financial crisis, or even our own experience with during the Asian financial crisis, when we did a huge stimulus. Times like these actually require a stimulus package. Government has to spend, because if you take the the GDP identity, which is C plus I plus G plus X minus M, your consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. Consumption will be down, investment will be down this year. Net exports will also be lower, and therefore government has to step in, which basically mechanically adds to the GDP and also creates a multiplier. Now, I've elsewhere also mentioned that this needs to be done within the constraints that India has, but there is no denying that there is a need for a stimulus, for basically boosting consumption and also some supply side. And given the lower GDP that we are going to have this year because of the COVID lockdowns, there will be a revenue impact. So, taking all these into account, one would expect an increase in fiscal deficit and therefore an increase in market borrowing as well.
So since you spoke about the fact that revenue estimates as well as expenditure estimates are likely to change significantly from what was factored in Budget 2020, would it be fair to assume that perhaps somewhere down the line we will need to see a big reset, which could also mean a fresh budget, because your Budget 2020 estimates on expenditure and revenue are infructuous in the current situation?
Look, Shereen, I think in India we have to recognize that a lot of policy making happens outside the budget as well. So the budget need not necessarily be a constraint for policy making. And I am someone who actually always believes a lot more in the substance than in the form. And especially given the fact that policy making happens outside the budget, as long as we are doing what is required to support the economy, whether it is actually about presenting a new budget or by other measures, I think that is something which I would not worry about as much. Also, do recognize that this is a situation where there is significant uncertainty. It's possible you present another budget and then again things change. In which case, do you want basically the 12 budgets to be presented in each of the 12 months? That's not feasible. So you have to keep that in mind as well. This is a period of significant uncertainty. So it's better that we actually respond, via the necessary measures that have to be taken.
Okay, so when you talk about responding via necessary measures, and in the context of what you just said, this evolving uncertainty, when we last spoke, you also said that we will need to take a much more calibrated approach. Now, the view from industry, from the sectors that are feeling the heat at this point in time, that time is of the essence, and the wait has gone on for a fairly long time for relief, for support measures from the government. What is holding it back? What's holding the package back? Are there any specific considerations that the government is weighing, which is what is holding the package back?
There are many considerations, including the ones that I have spoken about, and ensuring that all the inputs that have come in are also actually account. There are inputs coming in, as well as in the last few days as well, and weeks, inputs have come in. So they're all being taken into account. As I've insisted with you earlier as well, the decision about when to announce it is above my pay grade, and this is all I can share.
Yes, I understand that, and I appreciate that response. But let me ask you this again. I mean, have all the inputs come in, and is the plan final? I mean, an announcement is a political decision, but is the plan final?
I can say that there's been a lot of work that has happened already in deciding all the key elements for the measures that need to be announced.
Okay. Specifically, as far as MSMEs are concerned, Mr. Subramanian, and there's been a long list of demands, including an further interest waiver for perhaps another 12 months at least for a credit line, which could be levered. What do you believe is the need of the hour today as far as MSMEs are concerned, since we've been speaking about them?
I think from the perspective of MSMEs, for them, liquidity support is what is really critical. A typical firm, especially if you take an MSME, turns its inventory over about 4 or 5 times a year, and so an increase of about 20 to 25% in their credit, can really help them to tide over, a quarter of two of difficulties. So liquidity is what is really critical for these firms.
Along with the credit guarantee provided by the government?
That may be actually also, have to be kept in mind given the, some of the risk aversion that is prevailing in the banks.
Well, speaking of what you said, that the fiscal package, the stimulus or support or relief package will have to be within the fiscal constraints. How would you, at this point in time, consider the way that rating agencies will view the moves of the government, the borrowing plan, as well as the medium-term outlook as far as revenue and expenditure is concerned? Is the government factoring in how rating agencies will be viewing this? And what the concerns are?
As I was saying earlier as well, Shereen, we are keeping in mind all the considerations. Policy making has to be nuanced enough to take all these considerations into account, including the, the rating, including that, our tax to GDP ratio and other, making sure that the stimulus packages of other countries are compared with carefully. All those are actually being taken into account.
My final question to you, sir, as far as the GST is concerned, and there is a constitutional obligation to provide GST compensation to states, but once again, the revenue assumption was very different from where we find ourselves today. Do you believe that there will have to be a need to redraw that?
Redraw what?
The revenue consideration as was promised to states, the basis for the compensation provided to states. The 14% formula. That formula actually, is being adhered to, and in fact, already money has been transferred to states, and the commitments that have been made at the time when the GST was signed will be adhered to. Before I let you go, since you have spent a fair amount of your time in not just last year's economic survey, but the previous year's economic survey, highlighting the issues with the labour market as well as the need for deregulation, what would your prescription be as more and more states look at what UP and MP are doing and go about deciding what to do with their labour laws? What would the safeguards be? What will the checks and balances be that you believe need to be put in place? I think, the template that's been provided by these two states are actually are in the larger interest of creating jobs for our youth, which is by far the most important national priority that all of us must be attending to. And, we've provided very careful evidence for the fact that, these restrictions, and not just the specific one that we, employed in the economic survey, but more broadly, these restrictions act as a binding constraint for firms growing bigger, and thereby actually not only becoming more productive, but also hiring more people, in the formal sector.
So these are actually, I think, very important path-breaking reforms that states actually should look to implement.
All right, Mr. Subramanian, we will leave it there. Appreciate you joining us here on CNBC-TV18. That's the Chief Economic Advisor, with the moves by the UP and the MP government to suspend or do away with most labour regulation for the next 3 years or so. Remember, these are ordinances. They have not been given presidential assent just yet, but the CE is saying this is the way forward for most states to bring in more formalisation as well as create more jobs. We'll take a break. There's a lot more coming up. Don't go anywhere.